Last time Hello and welcome to Ask Ila, the Print's weekly show on the economy. I'm Remya Nair and I'm joined by Professor Ila Patnaik, a well-known economist and a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. The Indian economy was expected to grow at 12-13% in the current fiscal, but the second wave of the coronavirus pandemic has badly hit the economy. All growth forecasts now peg the economy to grow at much less than 10%. Also, many states have been forced to bring in localized lockdowns to contain the spread of the pandemic. That is obviously going to affect economic recovery. But what factors will play a key role in the economic recovery going forward? These are some of the questions that we will ask Ila today. So please do send in your questions and I'll be happy to ask them to Ila on your behalf. Ma'am, I'll begin by asking you that what kind of a role will consumer sentiments play in the recovery going forward?
I think what we've started seeing a little bit of is that in urban areas, consumer sentiment has improved. So as the number of cases have gone down, people, I guess, have started feeling that things will come back and the lockdowns will end. And so consumer sentiments have improved. They haven't yet improved in rural areas. In fact, given what we know about the spread of the virus, they might actually even worsen for some time in rural areas. But eventually, what seems to be happening, of course, one doesn't have any rigorous data on this, but what seems to be happening is that when the number of cases go down, then people feel a little more optimistic about spending.
Right. But also this pandemic has meant a loss of lives, loss of livelihoods for many. So what kind of a role will that play if, the only, say, the breadwinner of the family has lost his life?
Yes. So, of course, wherever the, if you have 2-3 lakh deaths and out of those, so we don't know the numbers in terms of the breadwinners. So we know, of course, the number of deaths, but not in terms of the breadwinners. But wherever that happens, then, of course, consumer demand gets affected. Now, if not, then it is very traumatizing for the family. And I think for some time, we can easily expect that demand goes down, just the sheer trauma of the illness and death. But eventually, if the breadwinner is not the one who has died or who has become so unwell that he or she cannot work, then in those circumstances, in terms of consumer demand, we would expect that in 3-4 months, that demand will come back.
Right. The number of cases is going down, but most of the states have completely halted vaccinations because there's no stock of vaccines. How important would be the pace of vaccinations going forward, and what kind of a contribution do you think that will make to economic recovery?
So, it will make a very important, very, very important contribution. So what are the 2-3 ways in which, at least in the short term, say 3 months ahead, we get protected? One is, of course, if you get COVID, then the chances of a reinfection in the very short term, say in the next 3 months before you're supposed to get the vaccine, those chances of you have antibodies basically. So those chances are lower. Second is the vaccination program, which is much, much bigger. So, the number of people who get COVID versus the number of vaccines, it is the vaccination program that is the main driver of immunity. Third, of course, is COVID appropriate behavior. So to the extent that people are now scared of actually getting COVID, which perhaps earlier they weren't when the lockdowns were open, because you didn't see that kind of spread and you didn't see that kind of hospitalization and deaths in the first wave. So we might expect that COVID appropriate behavior will be relatively, people themselves will actually behave differently. I mean, one can hope that a lot of people, so of course, not everybody and nowhere does everybody do that, but one will hope that after this experience, people will, behave differently. Because the number of vaccines and the vaccine supply may take some time to stabilize. The orders with vaccine companies are still long. They have long lists of orders. Those countries that have already placed orders, and those supplies will go to them first. And in the meanwhile, what can we do? So in the meanwhile, we expect we'll have some local lockdowns, we should have COVID appropriate behavior, so that we can reduce the impact, and we can reduce the spread of COVID. I mean, if without vaccines we open up again, then again the virus will spread very fast.
Right. And one has seen that many manufacturers, even companies like Zomato and Swiggy, have made a conscious effort to vaccinate their staff at their own expense. So that they're clearly trying to ensure that there is no disruption to their business per se from the pandemic.
Yeah. So after the decision in April of the government, where companies were allowed to vaccinate their own staff, we are seeing a lot of that happening as well, where both for the, for keeping the company going, and for looking forward, where they can say that, look, our staff is vaccinated, so you engage with us. That has started happening. And to the extent that vaccines will be available and that gets rolled out, that will lower the economic impact. So certainly those companies who do this will be relatively better off than the others.
All right, I'll start taking viewer questions. Raghav is asking, what impact will the movement of migrant workers and any possible economic stimulus for them have on economic recovery?
See, what has happened in the last in this wave and in this lockdown is that workers have gone back voluntarily. So in urban areas, you don't find workers who would normally have been there. They went, we know the story of the first wave, but when they came back, then in the second wave, either it's because of local lockdowns or because of expectations of lockdown and loss of livelihood, many of the migrant workers have gone back. Now, their coming back depends, one, on whether local lockdowns will be lifted. But even when local lockdowns are lifted, I expect that it would take some time for people to trickle back in. Unfortunately, in India, people cannot just afford to stay at home and not work. I mean, yes, there are people who are going back, and we know that Manrega demand has increased hugely. So but even those 100 days per family, those get exhausted, and people cannot afford to just sit and do nothing. I mean, that the bulk of the male population, in fact, you find that is almost always in the working age. The male population in the working age is almost always in the labor market, either looking for work or is working. Sometimes, as I think some of the data is revealing, has happened in the last 1 year, wages have gone down. So when you are looking for work and you don't get the same wages as you did last time, but you can't afford to just stay unemployed, then wages, like in the classical, labor markets, wages go down. So wages are downwardly flexible. So that's the kind of thing that seems to be happening. And that means that when migrant workers come back, it might happen slowly. And second, unless economic activity picks up, then also it may be at a lower wage level.
So one would expect, or one would hope, that the government again increases the MNREGA allocation like it did last year as part of the relief package, because as you said, there's a huge surge in demand for MNREGA.
Yeah, that could happen because there is a huge surge.
Right. The next question is from Dipanshu Sengar. He's asking, what's the way forward, livelihood versus lockdown?
Well, livelihood and lockdown, it's not versus. So it's lives versus livelihood and lockdown. So, when you put a lockdown, you lose livelihood, but you save lives. And I would say that, we all know and understand that life is most important. So, you have to be alive to be able to have a livelihood. So it's always lives versus livelihoods. And that's why we are seeing lockdowns. That's why we are seeing, even if there's not been a national lockdown, and that a national lockdown was so unpopular that you might have thought that some of the other State governments might not want to do lockdowns because they don't want to be unpopular. Yet you are seeing that state governments are also imposing lockdowns. There are local lockdowns. And that is mainly because once you start losing lives, then, livelihood always comes second. Then, because once you start losing lives, there's no going back.
Right. Niranjan Balu is asking, will there be another round of brain drain as the unemployment and job losses number rise?
What brain drain?
I think he's talking about people looking to go out of the country, I guess.
I mean, it depends on the horizons at which you are talking. So if you're talking in the immediate horizon, then I don't think that's too much of an option, because you don't have, most economies have, some may start recovering, but the rest of the world has a lot of restrictions in place. So this is not a time when you would expect to be, flying out for jobs abroad. But if the question is about the longer term, then it really depends on how we do versus how others do, whether they welcome, how much they open up, and how they give visas. It's a very complex issue. Brain drain is not merely about a short-term push factor. It is about long-term push and pull factors, and whether other economies require additional labor force. What kind of labor force do they require? They have to give us visas before we can decide to go.
Right. Nishan Koster is asking, does government enjoy any fiscal space this year for any Atmanirbhar Bharat-like package in the coming months?
I don't think there is a lot of fiscal space for a large expenditure package. In fact, you are already seeing, we saw some stress in the bond market. And if the government starts borrowing hugely, then unlike some of the advanced economies who actually have the capacity to borrow, because they will not be, their credit rating doesn't come down. If somebody is printing dollars and is the one who can produce international currency, or whose bonds people want to hold, in other words. So when you produce international currency, then people want to hold your bonds. Then you don't really have the kind of losses that we have if we start borrowing a lot and have credibility. Our credit rating goes down. So, neither is there a lot of fiscal space in terms of additional taxes, nor is there a lot of space in terms of additional borrowing that can be done. There has been additional expenditure, Manrega, health, etc. There are, of course, some things that the government had planned to spend on and couldn't spend on. But of course, many of those would get compensated by the planned revenue that didn't come in, such as the disinvestment revenue. So it's not a time when India has a lot of fiscal space.
Right. Farhan Khan is asking, considering the fact that population is declining in most of the rich countries and demand is decreasing, will India even be able to recover from the lockdown?
Considering that population is declining?
Declining in most rich countries. I think he's talking about an export-led demand increase in India.
Okay, so if you're talking about exports, then exports have already started doing well. That other economies have started recovering. So the US economy is recovering. And in fact, in the first week of May, data shows that exports grew at 80%. So the Indian exports to the world. So we stand to gain from the improvement in global demand. Because exports do help in pushing up the economy. So when you look forward at the next, at the coming quarter, okay, or the next quarter, then if the world starts picking up very fast, it's very good for us, because yes, it will help the economy to get higher demand on the basis of export demand, even if domestic consumption demand is sluggish, but high growth in export demand will help pull aggregate demand up.
Right. Ankit Nakshani is asking that there are reports that fourth quarter GDP projections is around 2%. So what does this mean for the -8% growth that was forecast for 2020-21?
So I don't know why he's just focused on the forward-looking fourth quarter, right?
No,
So
the fourth quarter GDP numbers that will come later this month.
okay, so I haven't done the calculations on what the 2% does to the 8%, but of course you can always do the calculations on that. I guess if the
Not as
number is
optimistic
below,
as, yeah, it's
yeah,
not
I
as
mean,
optimistic as
yeah,
initially.
obviously, if if in February and March, so the fourth quarter ends on 31st of March. So if you did not perform as well as you thought you would, it will pull down growth project, the expected growth, estimated growth rather. We'll get the actuals a couple of years later.
Right. Hitesh Nortyal is asking, which sectors of the economy do you think need urgent attention for demand to pick up?
Well, there are sectors that are really down at the moment, which are facing the worst demand crunch, like hospitality, like tourism, like aviation, cinema halls, malls, the large number of sectors. Then there are some such as construction, where the issues are not so much demand side, but still to some extent demand side as well, that people will not spend on building a new house when income is uncertain, or at least they won't spend as much as they might have wanted to spend on. So, it's mixed, because you do see some increase in demand. You see these urban demand moving from smaller houses to larger houses in suburbs. But again, it's let some people will demand that, but others may be relatively cautious. Essentially, those sectors which produce non-essentials are the ones that will face the biggest demand crunch. Whereas the essentials, I mean, we can't live without food and without, so FMCG, consumer goods, shampoos, soaps, toothpaste, etc. will, even if there is a little subdued demand now, that will come back up. So that's not as worrying as the non-essentials, which will see the largest hit, and especially those which require mobility, which require people to move.
Right. Apar Purvar is asking that common man depends on crowdfunding for the treatment amidst the second wave. So he's asking if it's not a good idea for the government to go for an insurance scheme for all. I guess some kind of a social security net for all, so that people don't spend too much on COVID treatment.
So there are. If I just say what is my opinion, then at the moment, I think everybody wants that, this is not a disease that we created, so why should we suffer? But if you think of, say, a longer term perspective, not just now, and now anyway, I don't think that a lot will happen in terms of insurance for COVID right away. But in terms of a longer term perspective, the thing to think about is moral hazard. By moral hazard, usually what we're trying to say is that whenever the insurance is provided, then insurance has to be provided in a manner such that it does not make the person more have risky behavior. So if you are to provide insurance, and if that makes people think that, oh, so somebody is going to take care of it, and let's say it's no longer life threatening. Today, the way we feel, it's life threatening, and we don't really want, we may not have a risky behavior simply because we don't want to die, not because of the money. But when you turn to the money, then a policy will have to be made in such a way that you do not get moral hazard. Considering the kind of behavior we are seeing, where people are going up in flights and getting married, it's not then when for the government to take the responsibility of providing them with healthcare could increase the riskiness of such behavior. I'm just giving an example to try to explain how, when you think about insurance, then how do you want to think about it looking forward? You don't, this is something where you actually want people to be very, very careful. And yet, of course, there are public hospitals, and in those people can go to public hospitals, and there are public facilities. Though if you go to private facilities, then you have to pay for it. But looking forward, you may want to increase public facilities, you may want to increase public hospitals, rather than to say that we'll pay the money wherever you go, and you don't need to be very careful. So, not to say that this is what is happening today, but simply that please think about those issues when you think about providing insurance for anything, actually.
Right. Many questions coming in, but this will be the last question that we'll take. Can you please talk about youth unemployment and how will this affect the economy? It's asked by Mr. Night Owls.
Yes, Mr. Night Owls, youth unemployment or any unemployment actually, which is being caused because of the lockdown and the COVID situation, is very, very hard for those who face it, is very bad for the economy. It reduces demand. It also has effects on your ability to get employment later, because if you are unemployed for a very long time, then it reduces your ability to get unemployed, to get gainful employment later. So this is going to have as bad an impact on the economy as any long phases of unemployment do. So it is bad, and it will be bad if young people in the country don't get jobs.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all these questions. Thank you to all our viewers for sending in questions for the show. Please do stay tuned in to our YouTube channel for